everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's session, Equitable Assessments in Math and STEM. My name is Yasmin Zaka. I'm on Coursera's marketing team. And then also from Coursera as well, we have my colleague Becca, who will be behind the scenes managing everything Zoom related as well. And it is my great pleasure today to announce our speakers, Joel Amidon and Natalie Hobson. Joel is an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education at the University of Mississippi, co-host of the Teaching Math Teaching podcast, host of the Amidon Planet podcast, and former high school mathematics teacher. His specialization is in mathematics education and the improvement of pedagogy to address issues of equity and diversity. Simply put, Dr. Amidon's work is focused on leading people to love others through through teaching. Natalie Hobson became a faculty member in the Math and Stats department at Sonoma State University in the fall of 2017. She received her PhD in mathematics and MA in mathematics education from the University of Georgia. She was born in Washington State and completed her BS at the University of Washington in mathematics with minors in education and diversity. She loves working with students and has been involved in many outreach programs. When not working with students or doing math, Natalie can usually be found riding her bike, swing dancing, sewing, or doing yoga. Natalie has really enjoyed the beautiful Sonoma County, her supportive and friendly colleagues, and her creative students. And with that, I will pass it over to Joel and Natalie.
All right, thank you, Yasmin, for sharing the bios, and also thank you for everyone for joining us. And if you still want to continue to respond to the chat, we're going to do a couple polls right now. But if you still want to respond to the chat with your name, location, and one thing you'd like to know about coming out of today's session, that would be fantastic. We're already learning a lot in the chat, which is really good. So Becca, if you want to put up the first poll, that would be great. You got about 30 seconds to respond to this one. It's pretty straightforward. How do you most identify as a teacher of the subject, as a teacher of teachers, as a support to teachers? So a teacher of teacher would be like teacher education. So I'm in math teacher education. There's a couple folks there. Most people are teaching subjects so far. And it's going to close fairly quickly. And Becca, am I the one that ends the polls, or are you the one that ends the polls?
I got it.
Oh, there you go. No, that's fine. All right. So we might not have captured everybody, but we kind of see where majority of us out there are teachers of subjects, and we have a decent amount that are support to teachers, and some people are teacher to teachers. And we got one other. Thank you for coming. All right. And you want to go with the next poll? Should we go with the next poll, Natalie?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. What subject do you most identify with?
And I saw in the chat someone is here interested in physics and astronomy. So if your particular subject area isn't on here, feel free to drop your subject in the chat as well, so that we can just kind of see where everyone is coming from.
Oh, I really like what Anya Goodman put in, teacher of students rather than of subject. That excellent. That's perfect. We got to be careful with language. And so I appreciate that. It's awesome. We have some pharmacy, geosciences, psychology.
Awesome.
More science.
Yeah.
All right. And ooh, culture studies. Nice. Electronics, physics.
Good mix here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
48% science.
Awesome.
Okay.
Take a few more seconds. Are we finished up? It looks like.
I think that gives us a flavor of who's in the room. We can also see what's in the chat. So thank you for participating in the poll.
Awesome.
All right, and I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen because let's see. And drop out of this. Okay. All right. So Natalie and I are going to just engage in a quick discussion about why we were invited to be presenters here. Sometimes we ask that question of ourselves, but no, we actually do know the answer to that. We were the authors of some briefs, some education briefs about getting started with equity. And as you heard in the bio, both Natalie and I come from a mathematics background, but don't worry, we know we were going to address some things from a STEM perspective. But if you have questions and things, you can keep dropping them in the chat. Yasmin is going to keep looking at them. And so if she sees like a burning question that addresses exactly what we're talking about, she's going to very politely interrupt. She's a very wonderful person, and say, hey, this would be a good time to answer this question. But we've also built some time in at the end to do a decent amount of Q&A, and then also to share some resources, because we also know that, yes, we've been provided with a space to share as as PhDs and experts or whatnot, but we know that there's a lot of brilliance in this Zoom room here. So we want to provide an opportunity for people to share some resources and things that maybe the conversation has brought them, hey, people should know about this. So we're going to offer some time to do that as well. But first, about these briefs. So they were put on by developed by Every Learner Everywhere. And basically the briefs were starting with the idea that if we were going to go to a department chair at a higher ed institution and say, hey, what would you need or what should you know about to get started thinking about issues of equity? What are some main ideas that you should think about? And so I wrote one, Natalie wrote one. We didn't really have we didn't have any interaction when we were writing them. So Natalie was coming from primary math background, and I was coming from primarily a math teacher education background. And then it was kind of interesting to see what kind of happened when you compared those two perspectives. There's lots of overlap, but then a decent amount that wasn't overlap as well. And so we had an opportunity to share at the ASU Remote Summit. Maybe some of you had a chance to attend that in June. And then we were invited to come here and share a little bit with regards to assessment and learning experiences from a STEM perspective also, but also willing to share about those briefs. So did I miss anything, Natalie? Does that sound about right?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. So we're going to just intro these briefs. There's going to be a link that's going to be dropped into the chat. That's going to give you a link to a podcast episode that Natalie and I did. So we had an opportunity to share at the ASU Remote Summit, but then we had more to talk about. And if you've got a podcast, might as well, hey, blow it out and just keep talking. And so that's the links to the show notes. And in there is a link to the briefs. You can also go to the Every Learner Everywhere website and search for the Getting Started with Equity toolkit. There's a big resource there for all the different subject areas. There's briefs on all these different areas as well. That's located at the Every Learner Everywhere site under resources. But we're going to share some perspectives that we have, or some things that we think relate to assessment from those briefs that we're going to get into now. We're going to kind of go into a back and forth sort of things. But I've been talking too much. Hey, Natalie, do you want to start first with something that you have?
Oh, sure. Thanks for getting us started. Yeah, so when I was preparing for discussion, I was looking at my brief and I realized that it was sort of out of the picture. I didn't assessment in mind as a focus. And so over the past couple of weeks, I've just been doing some of my own research, looking around, trying to read a lot to find, well, what does equitable assessment look like? Using some of the ideas that I've already been playing with about equity in my own math classroom. But things really stuck out. So I guess I'll start with one takeaway that I've been thinking about is providing students opportunities to do some self-assessment. So many different involved, but the idea teach and empower students to critique their own performance or critique their own solutions. This type of assessment would allow students to have a deeper learning experience and just given some questions to answer on their own, and to have you, the teacher, sort of grade or assess it. So when it does like assess, they need to learn what it looks like to critique work. They need to come from a place where they can differentiate what is correct, what is a conception, and how to then rise and conceptualize their understanding so they can kind of form deeper understanding. And it looks like I'm cutting out a bit. Maybe I'll.
A little bit. I wondered if that was my connection, but I don't know. So yeah, if you noticed it as well, and it might been. But let me respond to what you said too. So in same thing, when I was looking at the brief and thinking about what does it have to say about assessment. I mean, I think a lot of times when we're differentiating between, learning experiences and assessment, sometimes we're missing one of the big picture things about assessment, and that is, formative assessment. And so thinking about some of the types of learning experiences you would have in a class that's addressing issues of equity, you're going to have lots of opportunities for assessment because you're not going to be the one talking all the time. You're going to have rich tasks that are going to be where students are going to get to interact with each other, and you get to see those opportunities to engage and look at them. So, but one of the things I was looking at was from my briefs is I made a point about talking about differentiating equity and equality, right? Differentiating equity and equality. And I think one of the things that we think about more often than not is like about treating every student the same, when we know that not all students are the same, right? And so providing equity means providing the necessary supports so that they can reach that high expectation. If those of you familiar with the NCTM principles and standards for school mathematics, they have the equity principle, which talks about every student deserves high expectations and strong support. And so it's where the expectations might be equal, that I want my students to succeed to the best of their abilities, to achieve what they can, to not have any door shut to them from their conceptual understanding of a STEM field, but to know that they might need different supports in order to get there, and to think about how they demonstrate understanding. If we're thinking primarily about assessment, how do they demonstrate understanding? And so one of the things in looking back at 2020 is thinking about how do we provide a space, or how do we adjust our instruction when we're all having to go online, right? How do we do that? And there was this big, I don't know, crisis for some of the people, at least at my institution, where, oh my gosh, these things that I've been doing that I know that have been outdated for a long time don't quite translate to an online environment, right? And so now I'm trying to do the same exact thing that I've been doing for years and years, which I was already pretty broken and was only assessing in one way the conceptual understanding of the main topics that I'm trying to get at within my course. But now, how do I do that in this online environment where, shoot, this tool that they have in front of them, they can use to Google and find every assignment out there. I was in the Stephanie's Speaker. Anyway, she was talking right before, and she was talking about assessment from the heart in the previous session. But she was talking about that, like, we have this tool, we have this, this thing where, if we're given a quiz on basically trivia, like, our students can find all those answers fairly easy with, the most powerful device that we have with these computers. And so how are we really going about dealing with assessment? And so thinking about, well, now we need to change some of the things that we do in order to be thinking about how do we provide that sort of support? How do we provide insights into figuring out what students know? And it looks different. It's going to look different than what we've been doing, that at least I experienced as a student growing up, where it was, only the same mode of operation of there's only a few opportunities to show what you know, and they're primarily in one way, which was either a quiz or a test, paper-based. But I don't know, Natalie, you think your Wi-Fi might have cleared up from now?
We can test it.
All right. What's something else that came out from you in thinking about the briefs?
Yeah. So a lot of points too, that as you're talking, Joel, I'm like, oh yeah, we should talk about this and that. So let me try to hang on to one of them. So again, Joel, you mentioned the idea of having multiple ways in which for student learning, having multiple ways for students to learn provides multiple ways for us teachers to learn about what our students know, right? And so assessment, when it gets down to it, is about determining what our students know, right? And maybe not so much what they don't know. And so being able to have a more variety of assignments, some more projects, more collaboration work with students or collaborative work for students, having those types of learning environments can allow us as the educators to then determine what our students know. There's a lot of like difficult aspects of this as teachers, right? We have our own bias when we're looking at students. So if we do have, an assignment that's more of a traditional assessment, it can be a little scary. Or, if it's not an assessment, it can be scary to then determine, well, how do we know like what grade a student deserves or how many points a student deserves? So when we get into these types of situations that we have to do as teachers, right? At the end of the course, we have to get into grade, right? It becomes, there's a lot of tricky things that we have to navigate. So I think it's great to talk in these big ways about like, oh, we'll just give students these ways of like learning and it'll be great. And they'll just, have these projects and they'll talk to each other and they'll problem solve. But then it's difficult, like, well, then how do I actually score them, right? So what I was trying to say was, helping students learn for themselves how to assess their own learning, right? And so that can include things like providing students with, solutions that might already have errors, and then asking them where's the error in the student's work. Providing these types of experience can help students then, can help them practice assessing and critiquing arguments so they can better kind of self-reflect and determine for themselves, oh, am I understanding, this concept, or where is there a misconception, or where is there some, dissonance in what I think should happen and what is actually happen, so that they can then do that kind of self-reflection and then even learn more in the process.
Well, you're talking about some of the things like these institutional sort of structures that are in place, like we have to give a grade, right? And so that, it's like this necessary evil. And, I think Yasmin fed us a question in the chat, and that is I think Anya fed it before, is how do you do equitable assessment at an institution that has expected grade distributions, right? So, here's another sort of, institutional sort of, institutional structure that you need to follow, right? Well, one, there's something that Rochelle Gutierrez talks about, creative insubordination. There's some ideas there that you might want to think about, like, because, sorting, using a course in order to sort folks, rather than, hey, if everyone is demonstrated understanding of objectives that you have set out for a course and they've demonstrated mastery, like in our local school district, and something that we've been doing I've been trying to do at the university for a while, is having that sort of mastery sort of approach to assessment, and thinking about what exactly are the objectives that students are supposed to get within this class. I teach elementary math methods. So thinking about, I want them to be able to identify and use a good task. I want them to be able to, sort out student responses so they can provide some sort of a structure to their debrief of a complex task, or of a messy task, I like to call them. Anyway, but having that sort of approach where you're saying like, hey, each one of these students has demonstrated mastery of these objectives, and that then translate, like, why would they not achieve like this grade, right? Versus no, just because you've achieved mastery at a higher level. I don't know what you even say there. Like, if everyone has achieved the same mastery, why wouldn't they all get whatever the passing grade would be for that course? And so I know that is one of those things where, yes, there's some institutional expectations of this, but that's where there needs to be pushback on those sorts of things. And I hate to put it out there like that, but yeah, I've been more and more, I've been convinced that, there are these systemic things that are happening. I'm sorry, this might be a little soapboxy sort of thing, but systemic things that like we do need to push back on. And we're seeing some of those things, like, we're doing some things in our own program where we're overwhelming our seniors in this one semester over and over again. There's students that are not in a healthy way, and it's outside of the scope of this talk, but it's like, we need to push back on that. We need to do something about that. And like, we are taking steps to remedy that. And it's like, rather than saying like, well, that's just the way it is, and now I got to figure out how to work within it. How do we push back against those sorts of things? Anyway, sorry, that was a little soapboxy, but yeah, like dealing with some of those constraints and how do we move forward from there. Those are important, right? And thinking about how do we respond, and even how do we offer a great argument? Like, you know what? Here's my argument. Each of these, I've identified these objectives. They've demonstrated mastery of it. You tell them that because they've demonstrated all this mastery, that they don't get the grade that they deserve. I don't know. That's kind of tough, but it puts them in that position versus you, I guess.
And just to follow up, Joel, on what you were saying, I think that this also speaks to some practices in equitable classroom of having really clear expectations for students.
Yes.
Right. So that way students who are first generation, or students who have, different learning experiences, who come into the classroom where they don't know, they don't necessarily know how to interact or how to get their resources or what is expected from their teacher. So really having clear expectations. So that could look like in a more traditional assessment, or in an assessment, a really clear rubric with grades already distributed, right? So 5 points looks like this, 2 points looks like this. So it's really clear that you can then use, have a grading rubric to then grade students. And then that can not only, so that for one, can communicate to students what the expectation in the assignment is. And if there is institutional pushback about, oh, well, all your students got A's, then you can have that document as like, well, here's the rubric, by which you were assessing. And then I just wanted to say one last kind of comment, and this was from one of the chat about, the issue with, well, if everyone is demonstrating that they've met the objectives, then do we need to change the objectives? I guess my sort of question is, well, why can't everyone meet the objectives? Why do we need a system, or why do we feel like we need institutions or objectives where not everyone can meet them? So I think that might just be an interesting question, to reflect on at some point as well.
Well, and that leaps right into, wow, just like volleyball, like we're Olympians right here. So, this, one of the points I was thinking about is like adopting this asset-based perspective of students. And sometimes it's not about when I worry about students going forward, when I was like teaching high school and thinking about, having multiple ways to think about an asset-based perspective of our students, and thinking about how are the ways that they demonstrate their competence. And it might not necessarily be through the paper and pencil based tests, where I've seen, because I've offered rich tasks where I've got to walk around and see them interact with the content and talk to each other about math and get to hear those conversations. And then we get to the assessment that I had to give, because we gave universal assessments in that context. And so then I see that they're not showing the competence that they showed in that conversation that they had with a student just 2 days before. And they say, this question, like, tell me about it. And they start talking about it. And yes, what they said does not match what they wrote down. And so they have understanding of the concept, because in the verbal form that they were able to demonstrate their brilliance, it was clear. But on the paper, like, there was something that was getting in the way. So now my challenge was to teach the student about, hey, you're going to need to express yourself on paper. You're going to need to do that, because that traditional form of assessment is going to still be, or on a computer, like in a written format. So that is going to be there, and we need to work on that. But your mathematical competence is great. Like, you're showing that. And so now it's about modality rather than the actual conceptual understanding. And so thinking about it from an asset-based perspective, like how, in the earlier conversation, Stephanie was asked, the presenter from the earlier thing in this thread, Stephanie was talking about, what's your superpower? She said, name your superpower. And that, too often we have, we're talking about too often we're talking about kryptonite being Superman's deficiency, rather than he's got a lot of abilities, right? And so thinking about what are the abilities of the student, and yes, they might be lacking this ability in expressing themselves in a written format, but how do we help them use their superpowers in order to help them in their deficiencies, right? And so now we can, we're working from a place of strength rather than not. And so, some people talk about tests and quizzes. I got a paper coming out where I've never given a test or a quiz. I talk about celebrations. We celebrate our learning. because that's what we should be doing, right? We should celebrate what we know. We should celebrate all the brilliance that's in the room rather than let's just point, testing is like, let's point out where there's deficiencies, right? And that's not from me. That's from my cooperating teacher, Joe Dye, back in Wisconsin, but he was a brilliant guy. But I really like that because it's an asset-based perspective of our students. What do they know? How do we figure that out? And then if there's a problem with modality, how do we then support them, right? High expectations, strong support. So.
And Joel, I'll just follow up and maybe some like a little bit more like grounded approaches to kind of what you're talking about. Maybe also like at the end of the day, we want our students to be able to factor, right? We want our students to be able to understand a slope and, derivatives and whatever. And so if there are certain misunderstandings or deficiencies or kryptonites, say, that kids also have, then it's about celebrating those as well. So it's not maybe just about celebrating what we know, but also celebrating what we don't know. As many of you probably know, in brain research, our brain learns more and there's more brain activity when we make a mistake or when there is some cognitive dissonance, right? And so being able to message or send that message to students that like mistakes are sites for learning, and if there is something that is missing in your argument or in the way that you're, conveying your understanding, then that's such a fruitful place for you to then develop your brain and for you then to make sense of a situation. So I think celebrating, yes, thank you, Joel. Yeah, for dropping that. Joe Buller has done a lot of work on this idea of mathematical mindsets and about how to work with students on their errors and how to teach them how to love their errors. So that's also just kind of a follow-up in the whole idea of celebrating our learning and what we know, but also celebrating what we don't know as a way to, help us more.
Right. And the question was asked to me directly, like, how can we stimulate faculty use and create rubrics and assessments, for example, for qualifying tests in graduate school? So I'm imagining there's some sort of, need for, using some sort of rubric, right? And so I use a lot of rubrics. I think rubrics are fantastic. And the thing is, like, when I want a rubric, I think a rubric is in a good place when I can assess it, and then I'll have the student or someone take a look at their assignment and they might have a disagreement. And I say, okay, you can use the rubric as well, assess it, think about what you believe you received based on the rubric, and we'll come back together and we'll decide whether or not, where there's a disagreement and where do we need to rectify. Because another principle from NCTM, principles and standards for school mathematics, is about the assessment principle, that assessment is information not just for the teacher, but for the student. It should be a back and forth. It should be information on how is my relationship with the content. And so, too often we think about when we get an assessment, or when I basically get a grade on a test, it was a red number on the top of a paper. You looked at the number and then you tossed it away, versus like, what information does this have on my understanding of the content? And, giving that information and having that sort of perspective, and to see, like, I now know more about my relationship with mathematics. It's kind of like one of those, little quizzes you have on your relationships with somebody, like, ooh, like, we've got a good match or something like that. It should be information on your relationship with the content. And so now everyone's involved in that, so that it can be more informative across the board. And so now we can all figure out where to go going forward. And so having a rubric that is useful in order to show that, and that's maybe universal across several assessments. It's only not a one and done sort of rubric. I like a rubric with legs that kind of travels around. I can use it for different sorts of assessments. Those sorts of things can be helpful in order to, again, create that sort of DNA in your class about, we're communicating, hey, what do you know? What is your understanding of this concept? Or what is your understanding of the content across the board? And where do you need to work on some things? So.
Yeah, and then that can be super helpful feedback for students, rather than just a number, right? A red number on a page, but being able to have those, that more detailed feedback, so that they can then assess for themselves how they're doing and how they're understanding.
Yeah. And I know we're coming from, I know we're coming from a primarily math background, apologize, but that's just what we are. Those are our assets. That's what we can celebrate. So, but also I some of the books that I had, I wanted to mention here. One was one called Schooling Hip Hop. But basically the work of Chris Emden has been kind of helpful to me in thinking about perspectives and thinking about what are the assets and the things that people bring into classrooms. So if you haven't read that, he talks about hip-hop based education, hip-hop based science education. And he, in this book, this Schooling Hip Hop book, he talks about, some of these practices from hip hop that are then translate into the science classroom. So he talks about the rap battle being like, hey, I'm going to take this data and I'm going to have a theory for how it goes. And then the other scientist takes the data and says, well, yeah, I have a different theory about how it goes, and back and forth. And just like those sorts of perspectives, same as you would do in a rap battle or a cipher, where there's people that are offering different sorts of lines. So famous one that I think of is the Sugar Hill Gang, and the hip to hip to hop, hippity, that one. Anyway, they talk about offering a line and then offering another line, and that builds the rap, right? As it's a cipher. So same thing for, hey, I saw some evidence for this thing and I see some other evidence for this thing. And so opening up these practices that can be like, hey, there's other ways to demonstrate competence. Now, not saying that this is exactly what people should be doing in their classroom, but saying that you think about what are the common practices within that people have within your classroom, these, again, ways to demonstrate their brilliance, and how can you leverage them in order to teach content and also see what they know with regards to content. And so I think over and over again, we get to, in this field, at least in math, I remember when I was as a student, more often than not, I was put into a place where the teacher was at the board and they were disseminating math, or disseminating the content to me, and I just had to receive it. Versus now, it seems like there's my move when I started teaching was, no, it was about facilitating an environment where students get to interact with the content, and I don't necessarily have to be the one up at the board writing things up and people just following me, because then I can't do any assessment. I can't see what they're doing. I can't see how they're demonstrating understanding, demonstrating their brilliance. And so having rich tasks in order for students to demonstrate their abilities, use their ways of being smart in the world, is ways that you can then figure out what they know and figure out how they tap into that information. I think that just opens up your classroom so much, both in learning experiences and seeing what they know with regards to assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I saw that, are we ending at 40 or 45?
I think 45. I think we only got 10 minutes.
Yeah, we still have time. You guys are still good.
So I wanted to also follow up on Scott Miller asked the question at the beginning, or he was interested. They were interested in knowing, what is it an equitable assessment, or what is an equitable assessment? You judge an assessment as equitable, and this was something that Joel and I both got in our briefs, and that is to form a community of partners doing this type of work and doing equity, or having our classroom be more equitable. And so to answer that question, like, I don't have an answer, but explicitly a lot of answers you get. I'd suggest like asking around at your school, giving your assessment, if you have a more traditional assessment, giving it to a colleague and saying, who's being left out of this assessment, who's doing well, who do you think will not do well, what kind of skills is this assessment actually addressing? What is it subtly addressing that I really, don't need to assess on? A lot of our assessments can do things like, it actually assesses how well a student can draw a straight line, rather than how well they understand, proportional relationships. So by, forming a community at your school, or maybe with fellow colleagues here at this session, or at this summit, can help to then work together to make our assessments more equitable as well.
Yeah, having those. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go for it.
No, I was going to say, just like the bouncing back and forth that we've had in our conversation has been like throughout our interactions. I mean, offering different perspectives, thinking about it, and then basically making each other better. And for those of you in education, we're just talking about like the zone of proximal development, where we just keep going up and up and up with our ability to help each other achieve better outcomes. So even to think like within this summit, like I think was it Anya before, who like, challenged our poll question about, hey, we're teaching a subject, are we teaching students? Like just those little things that just made me a little bit better. Ooh, yeah, I'm a little bit better now because of that interaction. And so having the interactions, especially across the field where it's, like we're math and math teacher education versus, is there people within, someone is doing something a little bit better than you at where you have a need and they can help you along. And then you have something that you can offer them, and back and forth and back and forth. Because one thing we just realized is that we're all smarter together. And I didn't coin that. There's a great elementary math book that's entitled that, but that's Smarter Together, where we can build on each other. That's why we do these sorts of summits, right? This is why, Course Hero is doing this, is because we're going to get smarter together. And so having that sort of consistent colleagues that you can interact with to sharpen each other, I think that one is one of the best pieces that we talked about, is like having that sort of partnerships that you can do to get better, but then also giving yourself some grace too. So if you're trying things that are new and trying to like, hey, I'm adjusting my assessment practices. Like Scott or Nick Panasic talked about using Flipgrid, and maybe the first time you use Flipgrid as an assessment device might not turn out best, right? You might have some struggles. So give yourself some grace and think like, even if I'm also learning something about myself with these assessments. Somebody said that earlier in the chat, is that, with assessments, they're not only learning about their students, they're also learning about themselves. And just keep that in mind and keep improving, and you keep getting better. Ooh, I love this. We have 7 minutes. Okay. So Yasmin gave us a question. You ready for this question, Natalie? I think it's a good one.
Cool. I'm reading it. Yeah, go for it.
Could the panelists address students who attempt to game the system? Arguments that because other forms of assessment are in use, the students should be able to adjust their marking according to their preference. So I'm going to ask Janet maybe a quick clarifying question. Like, are they using, you mean like choosing which form of assessment they use to like count? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so here's a recent example that I had in mind when I wrote that question. I had a student who, all the students were cheating on the quizzes at the beginning of the semester. So I said, hey, I'll take the quizzes away and you can just have the exams. And the class voted that they did not want that. And then at the end of the semester, a student who had blown off a substantial number of quizzes said, well, because I got an A on the exams, can I just do what you said in the beginning of the semester and just not count the quizzes? Because I did poorly on those because I had time constraints and so forth. To which, I responded, well, you do better on the exams because you had the value of the quizzes as a learning tool. If you chose not to use that learning tool, it's not fair to everybody who did, right? And so it's one of these things where there's debate about, I perceived different value in the quizzes than he did. And so that was kind of what I had in the back of my mind as I was writing that question.
I guess too, it's like, what is being, and thank you to Janice. She's putting out her own teaching. I'm going to ask some questions but one of the things is like, well, what are we getting out of the quizzes, right? So are those like demonstrating, we talk about depth of knowledge. So they're identifying like how well they know vocabulary, how well they can do certain things. And then thinking about like, well, what else could be used to demonstrate those abilities? And so like, for example, if it is about demonstrating knowledge of vocabulary and that is like the objective that I'm looking for, can they demonstrate that they know these terms and can use them purely? And like they've had opportunities through quizzes and then through an exam to demonstrate their expertise, and they didn't have that until the final thing. And then they showed their expertise. I would be fine with like, I don't think that's gaming the system. I think that's like eventually showing their mastery. Now, if there's cheating going on, there's different ways you could do that with regards to quizzes and things and how to use that. But then also thinking about it from a later perspective, like how do they apply these sorts of things? What are they doing with these sorts of topics? I remember like, in class, I had to memorize all these things, but then when I had to put the pieces together, like the vocabulary together in order to apply it to a certain context, to demonstrate an argument for why something worked or didn't work, like that was where like the expertise showed out, where I couldn't hide whether or not if I had the vocabulary down, that mastered that, I was able then to be successful at that later thing. And so it was a building on each other. So that's kind of my perspective on that. I don't know, Natalie, do you have a different perspective?
Yeah, well, I think that it just gets kind of complicated maybe when we change our grading distributions midterm. And so like we're all learning here, right? When we're like each quarter, I feel like I'm learning, right, about how to manage my class. But, going into the term with like, okay, here's a clear syllabus where here's what, how your grade is going to be distributed. And then, sticking with that can then just be a way to sort of hold everyone accountable to this, like to the same, expectations. And then it is very clear what your expectations are for the students throughout the term. And I think too, it's really common when we're, working with a student to feel like they are trying to game the system. But in the end, well, our students are paying really good money to be in our classes. And if they class money out, right? And so they're just to do what, like, they're trying to be successful. And maybe if they, failed an exam, or they're trying to see a way, well, oh, actually, if I did do good on these assessments, then shouldn't I get a better grade? Like, it's maybe less of a game, and it's more of like, they're trying to be successful, right? And so I guess just, I don't know, that sounds like a really tricky situation, but maybe trying to have that sort of clear syllabus in place at the beginning can just help to mitigate those conversations, and just help to have a document to rely on and to always kind of fall back on. So just a couple thoughts there.
Herbert has his hand up. Thank you, Herbert.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for this great discussion. So one of the key things I just put in the chat that, the key is, what was the goal of the assessment? So I found myself rating some things. I have two quick examples. One, I did the discussion post, or I post a video and then I say, okay, I put a question about something in the video. So my last one, I had a t-shirt on that said it's in the syllabus. And so I said, okay, what was written on my t-shirt? But before that, I showed a little picture of something that said, sorry, I can't, I'm grading papers till I die. And so about half the students said, I'm sorry, I'm grading papers till I die. Like, no, that's not what was on the t-shirt. But what was the whole point? The whole point was for them to watch the video. And they wouldn't have known the other thing if they hadn't watched the video. So I'm like, I can still give them credit for that, because the whole point was they watched the video. And then, like yesterday in one of my online discussion groups, their minimum response is supposed to be 200 words. I had a student who got 199. Now, okay, he didn't meet the minimum response, but he had a great response. One word, really, 190. The whole point was him to have a good response. So the fact that he didn't meet that specific criteria, I still gave him the credit for it, because the whole point was for the discussion to go on, not for him to necessarily get exactly 100 and 200 words there. So I think that's what, sometimes focusing on what is the ultimate goal is the key.
Yeah, and I think that is a great point, Herbert, is like, and I think probably for all of this is whatever we're trying to do in thinking about making our assessments more equitable and thinking about how to address some of these issues, is if we don't actually know what the point is of the assessment, like what we're trying to accomplish, what are the objectives for our course? I know I'm trying to accomplish that. I'm trying to use one of these books back here in our coursework this coming semester. And I'm thinking like, well, what's the point of our course? What am I trying to accomplish? What are the things that I need to put into place in order to get access to their understanding of those objectives? And that will be the constitution for my course. And like, if you've demonstrated these understandings, you're going to get the grade. Like, we'll figure it out. Like, if I have to come up with alternative ways to figure out what we'll get there. But then also honoring that, yeah, you do need to figure out how to demonstrate your understanding in some of these traditionally accepted ways. But I'm not going to let that interfere. If that's what the objectives for this course say you need to know, that's what we're going to count. So Natalie, I know we're at the end or 1 minute over. So do you have anything else to add on?
Well, was there any other resources you wanted to share, Joel?
Yes. Oh, this one is gold. And I would go for anyone that's teaching STEM. Teaching Math at a Distance by Teresa Wills. She's got a great website, teresawills.com, I believe. Anyway, you search her, you find this book, you search it. Anyone that's done, online teaching, or you continue to do online teaching, or even if you're going to be doing face-to-face, I'm going back face-to-face, but there's still principles in here that I'll be using. And she really does that foundational piece. And you see all my tabs in here. She starts off with these foundational pieces, like what is the point of your course? Now, how do you use these tools in order to accomplish it? And actually addresses some of these assessment pieces as well. And how are we helping our students engage with our content, right? Developing that relationship with the content and celebrating their learning, and not just, I think she really does a great job. And she's got tons of resources on her website. She's got tons of online stuff. This is if I had one thing to recommend right now, it'd be this. The Teaching Math Teaching Podcast did a book club on it. So there's some resources on that. If you go to teachingmathteachingpodcast.com, you'll see them there. Natalie, sorry.
Awesome. Oh yeah, no, that's what I was wanting to bring up. I'm currently reading a book. It's on my iPad, so I don't have as fancy of a show, but it's called Choosing to See: A Framework for Equity in the Math Classroom by Pamela Teta and Kendall Brown. Oh, there we go, in hardcover. So that's what I'm currently reading through, and it has a lot of great takeaways as well. I think also, I think we already shared the link to Joel's podcast in the chat. I'll send it over again. But you can go to that link, and it has not only the podcast that Joel did with me, but also some other links to our briefs and to other resources that we discussed in that discussion.
So I think we can officially end. But if people want to hang out, I have the ability to hang out for a little bit. Well, if people have questions or anything, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your investment in your students and in helping get better at teaching. This is fun stuff. So thank you for everything.